it's Effie, aka Effie, and thank you so much for joining me today for another video. Today's video is going to be about the infamous 1962 Alcatraz escape. This is just something that I felt I had to share with you guys. I got to visit Alcatraz when I was little, and I just remember thinking it was one of the coolest places I'd ever been to. This is a video I've wanted to make for a really long time, so I'm super excited to share it with you guys. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into the Alcatraz escape. So Alcatraz prison, also known as The Rock, was a former military base that they turned into a federal maximum security prison in 1934. Now, Alcatraz was, and probably still is, America's most famous prison because it was supposed to be inescapable. It was on an island that was about a mile off the coast of San Francisco. It was located in the middle of the San Francisco Bay, which is really cold, has really strong currents, that has sharks in it. It's just not the type of water you would want to find yourself in. And for the most part, it was pretty heavily guarded. Now, Alcatraz prison held some of America's most famous prisoners, such as Al Capone, Machine Gun Kelly, Arthur Doc Barker, who actually died in an escape attempt that he was participating in, and Whitey Bulger. Now, though there were many escape attempts over the years, nobody was ever successful until a group of 4 men hatched a plan that was so genius, you have to be impressed a little bit at least by it. Now, John and Clarence Anglin, who were both committed into prison in 1961 and 1962, were a set of brothers who were serving time for nonviolent crimes. But their big crime at the time was that they robbed a bank. And that landed them in prison, and they had attempted to escape from prisons before. So because of that, they were sent to Alcatraz because, as I mentioned earlier, you weren't supposed to be able to escape from it. Now, Frank Morris, who arrived to Alcatraz in January of 1960, had a really, really rough childhood. He was abandoned as a child, and that kind of started out a life that was really, really rough for him. And because of that, he turned to a life of crime at a very young age. And he was actually off and on in prison from the age of 13 on. Now, Alan West, who was 34 at the time of the Alcatraz escape, was also serving time for a bank robbery and was also at the island because of previous escape attempts at other prisons. And much like Frank Morris, he had been bouncing around prisons from the age of 14 and had just also led a pretty rough life. Now, something really, really important to mention about Alcatraz is that due to the fact that it was on an island and it had water beating against it all the time and harsh winds beating on it all the time, and combining that with the fact that it had a pretty minimal budget, so it wasn't able to make necessary repairs on the prison, it kind of started to deteriorate. And because of that, those 4 men were able to hatch a plan that was heavily reliant on the fact that the prison was starting to fall apart. So in early 1960, Alan West approached Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers and started talking to them about an escape attempt that he had come up with. Due to his work on many different maintenance crews and his work in all different areas of the prison, he had become pretty familiar with the layout of it. He had become pretty familiar with what areas were structurally sound and what areas needed a little bit of work. And because of this, he was able to formulate a plan. And their plan was to escape through an air vent on the roof that wasn't covered in concrete, so it was open. So they figured if they could find a way to get that air vent off the roof, then they could escape through that. So now they just had to come up with a plan on how to get from their cells to the air vent and how to do it without getting caught. So in September of 1961, all 4 men requested to have cells that were close to each other in cell block B, which was right underneath the unsealed vent. All of the requests were approved and the men were moved closer together. And this made it easier for them to formulate their plan and to start putting it to work. So in order to escape, the men started thinking about what items and what materials they may need in order to be successful. And they started constructing them with really, really impressive skill. To make their way across the waters, the men constructed a raft that they built using rain jackets and rubber cement and then sewed it so that made it pretty waterproof. In addition to building the raft, they also built 4 life jackets so that if the raft failed, they had some sort of backup flotation device. Now, in addition to the rafts, the men had built fake grates that went on the wall, and it was to cover the fact that they were slowly chipping away at their wall and starting to make holes that they could fit through. And at first, they were able to just cover the holes using like different things in their cell, and they were able to kind of disguise it that way. But over time, the holes got a little bit bigger, so they built these pretend grates that they would put up against the wall, and it would look like nothing was wrong with their walls and that there was no holes being built. Now, the last thing that they built, and probably the most impressive thing, was these like paper mache plaster like heads. And they used these to trick the guards into thinking that they were sleeping. So they built these heads, they painted them, they took hair from the barber shop. Other prisoners who were kind of rooting for them helped them build these, and they were pretty realistic looking by the time they were done. Now, once they had all of these supplies built, they were ready to go. And on the late hours of June 11th and the early hours of June 12th of 1962, the escape took place. After the 9:30 p.m. check on the night of June 11th, the men climbed out of their bunks, they put the heads in their beds, covered it up with blankets so it looked like they were just sleeping, so that when the guards came by to do flashlight checks at nighttime, it would just look like they were asleep in their bed. They took the grates off of their walls and they climbed through. Now at this point, all 3 men made it through except for West. Previously, West had made his hole too big and he realized, I'm not going to be able to hide this. This is way too big to cover. So they had actually added a little bit of concrete back into the walls to make the hole smaller so he could hide it. However, in doing so, they actually made the hole much too small. So when it came time to escape, West could not get through the wall and he was stuck, just left in his cell. Now the other prisoners did try to help him a little bit. They tried to use a crowbar to get the concrete away from the wall. They tried to kick the concrete out of the wall. But after a few attempts, they realized this isn't going to work and they were left with no choice but just to leave West in his cell. Now, from their cells, the men exited to a utility corridor that was behind the cells. And from the utility corridor, they were able to travel to like a landing area. And this area was a key portion of their success in this whole entire escape attempt. Now, in the weeks leading up to the event, West had been painting that area, and the prison was really concerned with having just really nice floors. They wanted it to look like it was in good shape. Even though the walls were kind of in weakened condition, they took pride in making sure their prison looked good. So as West was painting, he swept a little bit of dust down into the area and was like, hey guys, I think if I hung a little bit of blankets up, it could cover this area so I could paint it and it could dry a little bit cleaner and things would just look nicer. Now, the guards didn't really have any reason to suspect that West wasn't telling the truth, so they let him hang the blankets. And it's reported that he hung a couple dozen blankets around that area and it was completely blocked off. Now, behind those blankets is where the men were able to work on everything. That's where they built the rafts, that's where they built the life jackets, that's where they built the heads, that's where they constructed all of their plans. And those sheets were left hanging for 6 weeks. So it gave them a long time to put everything together. Now, once the men were in the landing area, they got all of their stuff gathered together. They got the raft, they got their life jackets, they got little bags that they had containing a few personal items, and they started to climb a pipe that led to the roof. And once they got to the top of the roof, they were able to get out of the air vent because it was not covered in concrete, and in the weeks leading up to it, they had been able to successfully pry it from the roof, and that got them onto the roof of the prison. Now, it's believed that the men exited to the roof of the prison around 10:30 p.m. because it's reported that people heard a really loud noise at that time, and they think that was when the men were lifting the air vent and it was, falling onto the roof and it made a big sound. So from the roof, the men shimmied down a pipe carrying all of their stuff, which is pretty impressive. They climbed over several fences and they traveled to the kind of northeast shore of the island. And this was an area that wasn't super easily observable by the guards, so it gave them some room to work. Now, once the men reached the shore, they were able to use a concertina, which is a musical instrument that Morris had requested the previous April, and they had converted it into like an air pump type of machine, and they used that to pump up the rafts and to pump up the life jackets. Now, after that, the men put all of their stuff into the raft, they put their life jackets on, and they took off into the San Francisco Bay. Now, it wasn't until 7 a.m. the following morning on June 12th that anybody even noticed that they were gone. So they had somewhere around 8 hours to make their journey across the San Francisco Bay. So at 7 a.m. the next morning, the guards come around and they wake everybody up and they notice that these 3 prisoners are still sleeping. So one of the guards goes to shake Morris's head to wake him up, and the head falls out of the bed, which I can only imagine would be super scary at first when you go to wake somebody up and their head falls off. But it was right as that happened that the guards started to realize, holy crap, I think these guys escaped. So at this point, extensive search parties were sent out to try to find and capture these men. They searched the land on Alcatraz Island. They searched the water around the island. They searched little islands around Alcatraz Island. They searched the mainland. They searched everywhere, but they could not find any traces of the man. Now, later in the day, on June 12th, a paddle was found floating in the water off the coast of Angel Island, which is the island they were planning on sailing to, and it was deemed to be a paddle that belonged to the men. A few days later, on June 14th, bags that had been made out of raincoats that were holding personal items belonging to the men, such as pictures, contact information, letters, things like that, was found floating in the water between Angel Island and Alcatraz Island. Then on June 15th, a homemade life vest was found floating in the water. And on June 22nd, just 100 yards off of the coast of Alcatraz Island, another life jacket was also found floating. So a few items belonging to the men and that were used in the escape were discovered, but the men were discovered and no traces of them were ever discovered. Now, because West was left behind, he was able to give the FBI and give the police information and details about the escape, and really he's the only reason why we know as much as we do. And according to him, the plan was that they were going to take off of like the northeast shore of Alcatraz Island, and they were going to row with their paddles across the San Francisco Bay, and they were hoping to land on Angel Island. Now, from Angel Island, they were going to use that as kind of their midpoint. They were going to put their boat back in the water on the other side. They were going to go across a little area of water called Raccoon Strait, and from there they were going to land on the mainland. Now, once they were on the mainland, their plan was to steal guns, steal a car, steal clothes, steal some money, steal whatever they needed to have in order to be successful, in order to get away. However, nobody knows if any of that ever happened. Now, there are a lot of reasons to believe why the men did not survive the escape attempt. The water was really, really cold the night that they escaped. It was somewhere in the mid-50s Fahrenheit. So it's not water that you would want to find yourself in for an extended period of time. It's believed that if anything happened to the men, their raft started to sink or anything like that, and the men ended up in the water, that they would really only survive for about 2 to maybe 2.5 hours. After that, they would start suffering from hypothermia and their health would severely decline. Not only that, but there were also really, really heavy currents and pretty heavy wind the night of the escape. So it's believed that the currents would have pushed the men actually in the direction of the Golden Gate Bridge instead of the direction of Angel Island. So it would have been really, really hard for them just in a makeshift raft with their little paddles and only 3 men to be able to fight the current to actually make it to Angel Island. So it's more believable that they probably just drifted out to the San Francisco Bay and was pulled into the ocean. And to kind of support that theory, it was reported that about 6 weeks after the escape attempt, a Norwegian shipping freighter, so a big shipping ship, saw a dead body floating in the water about 20 miles off the shore of Alcatraz. And though they saw this body floating in the water, they apparently decided it wasn't important enough to report it until they got back about 6 weeks later. So they never found the body. They don't know if it was one of the inmates or if it was just another random body floating in the water, but it's entirely plausible that that could have been one of the men, but you know, who really knows. Now, one of the other main things that kind of supports the fact that they probably, you know, didn't survive this is the fact that after the escape, there were no bank robberies, there were no cars being stolen, there were no guns being stolen. There was nothing to support that these men actually made it and were able to successfully commit any of the crimes that they would have needed to commit in order to have the money and the supplies that they needed to successfully be on the road for an extended period of time. However, there are a lot of people, and I'll admit I kind of find myself in this group. There's a lot of people who kind of almost root for these men to succeed and they want them to have succeeded. And I think it's just because of like the underdog thing. This prison was supposed to be inescapable. They put so much work into this plan. They put so much time into this plan. Their stuff was so like skillfully crafted that people almost want them to succeed. And there are some reasons to believe that maybe they did make it. Now, one reason is because there were life vests found. There was an oar found. There were some personal belongings found. However, there were no bodies ever found. And if these men had died in the water, you would assume that they would have been floating in the water. So unless they were carried out to the ocean rather quickly, you would think that they would be floating in the area for a day or two and that they would have been discovered. However, there were no bodies found. So maybe they did make it to shore and maybe they were able to escape. Now, it's also been reported that family members of the Anglin brothers had communication with them after the escape attempt and have came out and said, yes, they made it, yes, they're fine. And though these things have never been confirmed, we have no reason to believe why the family would lie, like why they would just feed into this theory. But again, you know, it hasn't been deemed that, yes, the family really did talk to them, so nobody knows if it's super believable. And then another piece of evidence that kind of goes along with that I really don't know if it's super believable at all, is that there's supposedly a photo of the Anglin brothers that were taken in Brazil. And it hasn't really been deemed that it's them. Some people said, yes, it may be them. Some people said, no, it isn't them. They had sunglasses on, so nobody really knows if it was them. But it goes to show that maybe they did escape, maybe they fled the country, maybe they went to Brazil, and maybe they've just been leading a great life down there. Now, another piece of evidence on why the men could have possibly escaped, but again, this one isn't proven, so, you know, you got to take it with a grain of salt, is that 5 days after the escape, the FBI in San Francisco actually received a postcard with the signatures of the 3 men on it. However, the signatures didn't really match handwriting samples that the men had provided, and the fingerprint analysis didn't match up with the men. So it's never been proven whether this was real or whether it was a hoax, but it's just another little piece of evidence that goes to show maybe these men actually made it, and maybe they were kind of taunting the FBI. So, you know, I like to think that those things are real. I like to think that this actually happened because that makes it more exciting. But I feel like if that was actually the men's postcard, there would have been a little bit more proof. Now, the biggest kicker and the biggest thing that I think proves that maybe these men really could have made it, even if their plan went horribly awry, was that 6 months after this escape, in January of 1962, 2 men named John Paul Scott and Darrell D. Parker kind of got an escaped attempt from another prisoner. He had started coming up with it himself, but then he was being transferred. So he decided, hey, I'll just let somebody else know about this escaped attempt and this escape plan, and they can try. So after these 2 men got this escape plan, they decided, yeah, we're gonna try this. So the 2 men got out of their cells, made it to the roof, and were climbing over the edge down onto the beach. And John Paul Scott made it down. However, Darrell D. Parker got injured during this escape attempt, and by the time he was able to catch up to John Paul Scott was already gone. Darrell D. Parker was left behind, and he was recaptured on the island. Now, John Paul Scott, hard to believe, but he took a bunch of little surgical gloves, so like plastic surgical gloves, and he inflated them. And he was able to use enough of these that he made a flotation device, and he was able to float out into the San Francisco Bay. Now, John Paul Scott's plan was to go from Alcatraz to San Francisco directly. San Francisco was the area that he was hoping to land on. And he actually was somehow successful in this. He was able to float all the way from Alcatraz to San Francisco, and he was discovered the next morning by a group of teenagers. And he was super hypothermic. He was in really, really bad shape physically. However, he was alive. And to this day, he is the only successfully known prisoner to ever make it from Alcatraz to the mainland across the water. However, to me, this just goes to show that this guy was in rough shape, but all he had was freaking surgical gloves, and he was able to make it. So you would think with the raft and with life jackets, your chances are higher. And this man made it in December, so the water had to have been way colder than it would have been in June. So I don't know, as soon as I heard about that, it made me think, it's not totally crazy that these guys could have made it. So I don't know, I'm really curious to see what you guys think about it. Do you think they made it? Do you think they didn't make it? Do you want them to have made it? Are you like me where you're like, yeah, I kind of hope they did? Or are you like, nope, they were prisoners, they should have stayed in prison? Leave a comment below and let me know what you guys think. So yeah, that is it for today's video. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you enjoyed this, please be sure to give me a big thumbs up and hit that subscribe button down below. It really does help out small channels like mine, and I really, really do appreciate it. So yeah, until next time, I love you all very much, and we will touch base soon. Bye.